Pedro was born at 8 o'clock on the 12th of October 1798 near Lisbon, Portugal. He was named after St. Peter of Alcantara. Through his father, Pedro was a member of the House of Braganza. As the second eldest son, Pedro became his father's heir and Prince of Beira upon the death of his elder brother Francisco Antonio in 1801. In late November 1807, when Pedro was 9, the royal family escaped from Portugal as an invading French army sent by Napoleon Bonaparte approached Lisbon. Pedro and his family arrived in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, then Portugal's largest and wealthiest colony, in March of 1808. During the voyage, Pedro conversed with the ship's crew, picking up navigational skills. In Brazil, after a brief stay in the city palace, Pedro settled with his younger brother Miguel and their father in the Palace of St. Christopher. His education encompassed a broad array of subjects that included mathematics, political economy, logic, history, and geography. He learned to speak and write not only in Portuguese, but also Latin and French. He could translate from English and understood German. Pedro's character was marked by an energetic drive that bordered on hyperactivity. His restless spirit compelled him to search for adventure, and sometimes in disguise as a traveler. He frequented taverns in Rio de Janeiro's distributed district. He rarely drank alcohol, but was a womanizer. His earliest known lasting affair was with a French dancer who had a stillborn child by him. On the 13th of May 1817, Pedro was married by proxy to Archduchess Maria Leopoldina, daughter of Empress Franz I of Austria. When she arrived in Rio de Janeiro on November the 5th, she immediately fell in love with Pedro, who was far more charming and attractive than she had been led to expect. The nuptial mass, with the ratification of the vows previously taken by proxy, occurred the following day. 7 children resulted from this marriage. On the 17th of October 1820, news arrived that the military garrisons in Portugal had mutinied, leading to what became known as the Liberal Revolution of 1820. The military formed a provisional government. Pedro was surprised when his father not only asked for his advice, but also decided to send him to Portugal to rule as regent on his behalf and to placate the revolutionaries. The prince was never educated to rule and had previously been allowed no participation in state affairs. Pedro was regarded with suspicion by his father. His father postponed Pedro's departure for as long as possible, fearing that once he was in Portugal, he would be acclaimed king by the revolutionaries. On the 26th of February 1821, Portuguese troops stationed in Rio de Janeiro mutinied. Neither the king nor his government made any move against the mutinous units. Pedro decided to act on his own and rode to meet the rebels. He negotiated with them and convinced his father to accept their demands, which included naming a new cabinet and making an oath of obedience to the forthcoming Portuguese constitution. Under pressure, Leo VI and his family departed for Portugal on the 26th of April, leaving behind Pedro and his wife Maria. At the outset of his regency, Pedro promulgated decrees that guaranteed personal and property rights. Even the revolutionaries arrested in the Merchants' Exchange incident were set free. On the 5th of June 1821, army troops under Portuguese Lieutenant General Jorge Avilés mutinied, demanding that Pedro should take an oath to uphold the Portuguese constitution after it was enacted. Pedro rode out alone to intervene with the mutineers. He calmly and resourcefully negotiated, winning the respect of the troops, and succeeded in reducing the impact of their more unacceptable demands. While returning from Sao Paulo, he received news sent on September 7th that the Cortes would not accept self-governance in Brazil and would punish all who disobeyed its orders. Pedro mounted his bay mare and, in front of his entourage and his guard of honor, said, "Friends, the Portuguese Cortes wished to enslave and persecute us. As of today, our bonds are ended. By my blood, by my honor, by my God, I swear to bring about the independence of Brazil. Brazilians, let our watchword from this day forth be independence or death." The prince was acclaimed Emperor Dom Pedro I on his 21st birthday, which coincided with the inauguration of the Empire of Brazil on the 12th of October, 1822. He was crowned on the 1st of December. He had to force the submission of several provinces in the northern, northeastern, and southern regions. As a result of the highly centralized state created by the Constitution, rebellious elements of Ceará, Piauí, and Pernambuco attempted to secede from Brazil and unite in what became known as the Confederation of the Equator. Pedro I unsuccessfully sought to avoid bloodshed by offering to placate the rebels. The rebels were never able to secure control over their provinces and were easily suppressed. By late 1824, the rebellion was over. 16 rebels were tried and executed while all others were pardoned by the emperor. After long negotiations, Portugal signed a treaty with Brazil on the 29th of August 1825, in which it recognized Brazilian independence. A few months later, the emperor received word that his father had died on the 10th of March 1826, and that he had succeeded his father on the Portuguese throne as King Pedro IV. Aware that a reunion of Brazil and Portugal would be unacceptable to the people of both nations, he hastily abdicated the crown of Portugal on the 2nd of May in favor of his eldest daughter, who became Queen Dona Maria II. Regardless of the abdication, Pedro I continued to act as an absentee king of Portugal and interceded in its diplomatic matters as well as internal affairs. Miguel soon betrayed him in early 1828 and was acclaimed King Dom Miguel I. As painful as was his beloved brother's betrayal, Pedro I also endured the defection of his surviving sisters to Miguel I's faction. Only his younger sister, Ana de Jesus, remained faithful to him, and she later traveled to Rio de Janeiro to be close to him. Consumed by hatred and beginning to believe rumors that Miguel had murdered his father, Pedro turned his focus to Portugal and tried in vain to garner international support for Maria II's rights. Backed by the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, present-day Argentina, a small band declared Brazil's southernmost province of Cisplatina to be independent in April of 1825. The Brazilian government at first perceived the succession attempt as a minor uprising. It took months before a greater threat posed by the involvement of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, which expected to annex Cisplatina, caused serious concern. In retaliation, the empire declared war in December, triggering the Cisplantine War. On the 24th of November 1826, Pedro sailed from Rio de Janeiro to San Jose in the province of Santa Catarina. From there he rode to Porto Alegre, capital of the province of Rio Grande do Sul, where the main army was stationed. He was already on his way back to Rio de Janeiro when he was told that his wife Maria had died following a miscarriage. Meanwhile, the war continued on with no conclusion in sight. Pedro relinquished Cisplatina in August of 1828, and the province became the independent nation of Uruguay. After his wife's death, Pedro realized how miserable he had treated her, and his relationship with Domitila began to crumble. Maria Leopoldina, unlike his mistress, was popular, honest, and loved him without expecting anything in return. The emperor greatly missed her and failed to overcome his sense of loss and regret. He did not forget his children, orphaned of their mother, and was observed on more than one occasion holding his son, the young Pedro, in his arms and saying, "Poor boy, you are the most unhappy prince in the world." He had resolved to marry again and to become a better person. Because of Pedro's bad reputation in Europe, owing to his past behavior, princesses from several nations declined his proposal to marry one after another. His pride thus wounded, he allowed his mistress to return, which she did on the 29th of April 1829, after having been away for nearly a year. However, once he learned that a betrothal had finally been arranged, the emperor ended his relationship to Domitila. Days earlier, on the 2nd of August, the emperor had been married by proxy to Emilie of Lichtenberg. He was stunned by her beauty after meeting her in person. The vows previously made by proxy were ratified in a nuptial mass on the 17th of October. Amelia was kind and loving to his children and provided a much-needed sense of normalcy to both his family and the general public. Regardless of Pedro's failure as a ruler, he respected the Constitution. He did not tamper with elections, refused to sign acts ratified by the government, or impose any restrictions on freedom of speech. The emperor had indeed conceived a gradual process for eliminating slavery. Pedro also professed other advanced ideas. His denunciation of the divine rights of king, of nobility, supposedly superior blood, and of racism. The emperor's efforts to appease the Liberal Party resulted in very important changes. On the 19th of March 1831, he named a cabinet formed by politicians drawn from the opposition, allowing a greater role for the parliament in the government. To his dismay, his measures did not stop the continuous attacks from the liberals. He became unwilling to deal with this deteriorating political situation. Meanwhile, Portuguese exile campaigned to convince him to give up on Brazil, and instead devote his energies to fight for his daughter's claim to Portugal's crown. The ideal of abdicating and returning to Portugal took root in his mind. An opportunity soon appeared to act upon this notion, and to everyone's surprise, he abdicated on the 7th of April. Upon delivering the abdication document to a messenger, he said, "Here you have my act of abdication. I am returning to Europe and leaving a country that I love very much, and still love." At dawn on the morning of the 7th of April, Pedro, his wife, and others, including his daughter Maria II and his sister Ana de Jesus, were taken on board the British warship HMS Warspite. The vessel remained at anchor off Rio de Janeiro, and on the 13th of April, the former emperor transferred to and departed for Europe aboard HMS Volage. He arrived in Cherourg-Octville, France, on the 10th of June. During the next few months, he shuttled between France and Great Britain. He was warmly welcomed by, but received no actual support from, either government. Pedro assumed the title of Duke of Braganza on the 15th of June, a position that once had been his as heir to Portugal's crown. On the 1st of December, his only daughter by Maria Elmi, was born in Paris. While in Paris, the Duke of Braganza met and befriended Marquis of Lafayette, a veteran of the American Revolutionary War. Pedro bade farewell to his family, Lafayette, and around 200 well-wishers on the 25th of January, 1832. He knelt before Maria II and said, "My lady, here is a Portuguese general who will uphold your rights and restore your crown." In tears, his daughter embraced him. Pedro sailed to the Atlantic archipelago of the Azores, the only Portuguese territory that had remained loyal to his daughter. After a few months of final preparations, he embarked for mainland Portugal, entering the city of Porto unopposed on the 9th of July. Severely outnumbered, Pedro's armies of liberals was besieged in Porto for more than a year. There, in early 1833, he received news from Brazil of his daughter Paula's impending death. Months later in September, he met with a representative of the Restoration Party, Antonio Carlos, who asked the Duke of Braganza to return to Brazil and rule his former empire as regent during his son's minority. Pedro realized that the Restorationists wanted to use him as a tool to facilitate their own rise to power, and frustrated Antonio Carlos by making almost impossible demands. During the war, the Duke of Braganza mounted cannons, dug trenches, tended the wounded, ate among the rank and file, and fought under heavy fire as men next to him were shot or blown to pieces. His cause was nearly lost until he took the risky steps of dividing his forces and sending a portion to launch an amphibious attack on southern Portugal. The Algarve region fell to the expedition, which then marched north straight to Lisbon, which capitulated on the 24th of July. Pedro proceeded to subdue the remaining of the country, but just when the conflict looked to be winding down to a conclusion, his Spanish uncle, Don Carlos, intervened. In this wider conflict that engulfed the entire Iberian Peninsula, known as the First Carlist War, the Duke of Braganza allied with liberal Spanish armies loyal to Isabel II and defeated both Miguel and Carlos. A peace accord was reached on the 26th of May 1834. The war undermined his health. By 1834, he was dying of tuberculosis. He was confined to his bed in Quilmes Royal Palace on the 10th of September. After a long and painful illness, Pedro died on the 24th of September 1834. The news of his death arrived in Rio de Janeiro on the 20th of November. In 1972, on the 150th anniversary of Brazilian independence, Pedro I's remains were brought to Brazil, as he had requested in his will. Accompanied by much fanfare and with honors due to the head of state, his remains were reinterred in the Monument to the Independence of Brazil in the city of Sao Paulo.